Good evening to everyone. Thank you for coming tonight to this Woven Hug panel discussion at the Auditorium of Flowerfield Art Center. So some of you might be already familiar, but for the ones that don't know, Woven Hug or Abrazo Entramado is a participatory textile installation that seeks to embrace the city with a pair of textile arms filled with scraps, materials, and covered in design and fabrics embroidered by the city's inhabitants, or Portstewart's inhabitants in this case. This project invites us to reconnect after years affected by the pandemic and economic crisis. The first edition was presented in March last year at the Cultural Lab of Linen Biennale at Monterrey, Mexico, where we collected over 2,000 pieces of cloth recycled by the community of Monterrey. These were used by a group of volunteers of over 170 participants who succeeded in embroidering the 20 meters long woven hug. The participatory textile installation is now being recreated at Flowerfield's Art Center, and this installation is inspired by the Chilean arpilleras, that's a type of patchwork pictures of fabric scraps hand-stitched into burlap from the Conflict Textiles collection. The piece has been connected to the arpillera Donde están nuestros hijos, or Where are our children? And this inspiration has been forged through previous collaborations with Conflict Textiles with projects like Latin American Myth Deconstruction, Neonorte 1 in 2018, and also Conflict Textiles encompasses a large collection of international textiles, exhibitions, and associated events. Woven Hug has been made possible through partnership with the Linen Biennale, Ulster University, Queen's University, and Conflict Textiles, and with the generous financial support from the National Lottery through Arts Council England and the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. So before we get into the questions, I would like to introduce our panel guest speakers from tonight. So first, I would like to introduce one of our guest speakers that couldn't make it due to some medical problems. Her name is Jane McCann. She's from representing the Linen Biennale, is a leading authority on the subject of performance sportswear in the world of education. Her work as a teacher and academic has brought down barriers between design and science, opening the doors to new developments in the fields of textiles and fashion design. The results of her work have found a much wider application, taking her studies into the fields of sustainability design, intelligent clothes, among others innovative approaches. She has led positions like directing the Smart Clothes and Wearable Technologies Research Centre at the University of Wales between 2004 and 2012, and majority contributing to the creation of the Northern Ireland's Linen Biennale from 2018 until nowadays. She's currently teaching courses on functional clothing in China, contributing to textile-oriented magazines and publications, curating exhibitions, and is actively involved in the growing demands for the revival of performance sportswear design studies at a postgraduate level in Sheffield Hallam University. I would like to address Jane because I think it's important to point out that the whole development of this project has been done in partnership with the Linen Biennale, because when we had to adapt the Woven Hug first edition to Northern Ireland, we wanted it to connect to the textile heritage of the local region. Then our second guest speaker is Alison Gault from Ulster University. Alison has over 30 years of experience in the textile industry, extending from fiber development to fabric construction and production and product development. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, member of the Council of Higher Education in Art and Design, and President of the International Federation of the Knitting Technologists, and a lecturer in Ulster University. Her work spans a range of fiber, including polymers, wool, cellulosic, and bast fibers, including hemp, linen, and nettle. Alison has designed and developed a textile-inspired roof garden funded by the Department of Agriculture, Environment, and Rural Affairs, and is currently working on a Department of the Economy funded project investigating reviving Northern Ireland's textile industry and Arts Humanities Research Council funded project exploring the restoration of linen spinning equipment and the possibilities of processing fiber again in Northern Ireland. Our second guest speaker is Roberta Bacic, the curator of Conflict Textiles. So Roberta was born in Chile and is resident in Northern Ireland, is the founder of Conflict Textiles, an international collection of arpilleras very significant in the world. She holds a philosophy and English teaching degree and works as researcher in fields linked with human rights. During the period of Chilean dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet, Bacic dives into the world of arpilleras. The use of textiles artisanship allows her to denounce the repression and violence from which the Chilean people, especially women, suffered in this period. At a later stage, she would use her collection to export this language to other countries. And the third guest speaker is Cordelia Rizzo, with whom I've been developing as an artist Woven Hug project. So Cordelia is an academic activist and textile artist. Her research is based on aesthetics dynamics related to popular textile techniques related to manifestation. She explores the affective relationship between the making process, who elaborates the material, and the space where the piece is experienced. Her practice explores the links between the making, the materiality, and the context. She delves in female artistic practices that have been undervalued through history. She approaches these practices as aesthetic processes that have been undervalued by the establishment. Her pedagogy builds bridges between the textile making, political activism, and the imagination over forms of human and non-human relationship. She uses sensorial sensitivity as a space to acknowledge the environment, the construction of political projects, and the pedagogic base with her third job. Her textile work has been exhibited in Mexico at the Cultural Lab, in the United States during Chicago Textile Week at One River Gallery. Cordelia is finishing her PhD at Northwestern University in Chicago. And last but not least, I'm Tere Chad. I'm one of the co-facilitators of Woven Hug. I'm an artist and curator based in London. I work in various media, and I'm particularly interested in how textile artworks can, on the one hand, bring communities together, as we've been doing with projects like Woven Hug or Mending Voids, but also, on the other hand, how they can foster a more sustainable thinking. So now that I've introduced our speakers, I would like to start with the Q&A. So I would like to start, Roberta. How does textile practice encourage social gathering?
Can you repeat social
gathering?
Well, it's a very huge question, but I would say through textiles, you really relate to everyday life. It's a way to speak a language that's beyond the word and the intellect. It's about the senses of touching, the senses of feeling that you cover yourself, but also the feeling of the smell and the texture. So for me, during the times of the dictatorship, the women started to sew as a way to tell their stories. And the pieces were on their lap, and they could sense them, and they could feel that they were taking action in their own hands. If they were not listened, they were leaving a trace. So I think that is the great power that the textiles have. Also, the textiles would very often have a demarcation in themselves, as here you use linen or you use other materials. In Chile, you would have used the piqué and other things that would connect you to the ordinary things of life. So I think that is the basis of the arpilleras that were used as these little scraps of materials, everything handmade, and on arpillera material that is what we call burlap, and then changed into materials from the flour sacks.
So following that idea, then I would like to ask Alison, why are textile practices associated with women's empowerment?
Why are they, the last part, please?
Associated with women's empowerment?
Associated. I really think that, women have struggled for a long time to find their voice or to be listened to. And I think that, textiles can often be seen as a gentle female handicraft, and it almost, excuse the pun, it pulls the rug away from under the feet when they are doing something that's, creating something that's vitally important, and they're using that as, a way of expressing how they're feeling quite loudly. And sometimes that can be in a secretive manner, so that it can be, if you think of the suffragettes 100 years ago, they were subliminally writing sort of different pieces of text, giving times and dates for people to come and meet, at the rallies, but also using colours in their textiles to express a meaning. And we've seen that, more recently in the pussy hats and the kind of activist and, the ways that they are expressing how they're feeling. You were talking about their feeling and expressing that in a way, through their feminine handicrafts. And I think it can be very empowering, actually, and they are finding their voice in that way.
So I would like to ask Cordelia to delve a bit deeper in this idea of empowering, and also to tell us from your experience, when does textile art become political?
On that regard, I would say I actually think that textile, I would favor a very broad definition of the political, and perhaps even just the labor of being a textile worker is always very in close touch with a political position, just because it was one of the first types of jobs or gaining money for many women and people who are marginalized. So that is one. There is always, the potential is latent there. And I would, from my own experience in 2012, it becomes political when it's the medium to express a political need and a political form of assembly, as well as Alison put out about the suffragettes, and a way to feel politically and to build the political self, as Roberta also mentioned about feeling the arpilleras in the lab. So it's a source of many resources of the political, not just expression, but also self-creation or group creation or strengthening of a political ideal. So I would say that all of that happened in 2012 when drawing from a group that had already formed in Mexico City. The name of the group is Fuentes Rojas. The mothers of the disappeared in Monterrey decided to adopt embroidery as a form of expressing themselves. So they embroidered small, short narratives of their brothers, their children, about their children. Some of them were also there because of their brothers. They synthesized the story and they embroidered it in white handkerchiefs with green thread. So it's political because it sources all these moments. So I would say the moment is political when it tackles a political need. It might not even be explicitly political, as it's definitely something that is done especially to avoid the surveillance of the state that might want to punish a political expression. So yeah, this is my performance studies scholar coming out. It can also become absorbed by the state and depoliticized as well. Like it can become too comfortable as well, and so the political power, its power to achieve change, might diminish. So it's something that comes and goes, I would.
So following up this idea, because you're telling about how women and people can actually portray a narrative of something that has happened through textile. So I would like to ask Roberta, from your arpilleras background, if you could tell us a bit more, how can embroidery and stitching facilitate different ways of constructing narratives? And if you can place the microphone well so that we make sure the recording works, it would be great.
Does it work there?
A bit closer.
A bit closer, okay. Yeah, it's very interesting, the question, because I think the strong voices of the women through the work was also a way to respond to a moment when the men were not around because they had been either abducted, were in jail, had disappeared, or were in exile. So it was a way of coming together. The power was not only in the story they narrated, it was, we are not victims in per se, we are actors in our own history. So I think that element was very important. Many of the women were also part of the movement against torture, Sebastián Acevedo, and embodied in their bodies also performances like the Cueca Sola, dancing alone. In the piece that you have here at the entrance, you can see the question, the simple question and direct, where are our children, is a question that was thrown to the public in general, not necessarily only the people who were sympathetic. Where are our children? Every mother looks for their children. And then the maker, who didn't sign the piece, made a little message that you have there in a photograph and hid it behind in a little pocket in the wish that when it reached other audiences, they could hear the prayer of the women in Chile. So that, for instance, in that case, the little story or the little letter that she wrote was found by me 25 years later than it was written. It was written in 1979. So this power of being so creative and so resourceful to take a piece of a book of a child and writing a note, finding a pocket and finding the way they let it go. So it's also a way of their work left them. They did it and they let it go. It wasn't to have it for yourself. It was to share it and disseminate and also tell to others. But behind all this work, there were lots of organizations and solidarity people who would have, as they called it later, trafficked the pieces, and many men who facilitated that process. So it's a very many tentacles and hands working in this process to have them in different countries. In Chile, they were not very much known. They became known through the use that was done outside the country.
Well, and I would like to connect that experience to maybe what has happened in Northern Ireland. So I guess that Alison Gault can give us some answers. So did Northern Ireland's textile heritage take any particular form of expression during the Troubles?
Well, I suppose Northern Ireland's textile industry was still here during the Troubles, and a lot of the spinning mills and the weaving sheds and facilities were in those areas that were right in the central to the conflict, and it probably highlighted where there had been friendships and communities. People from all different religious backgrounds coming together to work together, whether that was in Mackey's, which was the engineering building of the weaving equipment, if you like, right through to whether it was York Street Mill, where my grandmother and my great aunts all worked as reelers, or across, in East West, and across actually, Northern Ireland. It wasn't just in Belfast, but a lot of those societies became, largely divided, I think, in the 70s. I actually wasn't here until 1980. Even though I was born in Belfast, I lived in Cork and then in the northeast of England. But I know that looking in terms of history and that period, that a lot of it became more difficult, for instance, to continue friendships, and there was a sense of polarization and isolation. And I think that there was a breakdown in our society, and I think that was a tragedy, really. And then we had the demise of when I worked in the industry, you could see that it was largely going to the east because of the cost of employment. In Northern Ireland, and really during the 90s, late 80s and mid 90s, mid to late 90s actually then, all the spinning, apart from Donegal yarns, which is still going, but all the linen spinning had gone. And a lot of the weaving had gone actually at that stage too. I know that I did lobby and have lobbied ever since the late 90s, both the North and Southern governments regarding bringing linen back and actually bringing the textile industry back in a greater, more, exponential way. But I think we are now seeing a change in the tide with, different things obviously happening globally. One of them being, that actually employment is now becoming equally as expensive in China. We are seeing a tipping point regarding fast fashion. So I know I'm off the political agenda, but I think it still is political. So people are now becoming aware that, essentially having our textiles produced in countries that are ethically unsound, badly treat women and children, or war-torn, actually, and our own consumption desires are supporting a clothing industry or a textile industry globally that we shouldn't be part of. So I think ethically and politically, to come full circle, yes, there was real difficulties there, but in the 70s, but I think that actually it's become a global issue. We now need to really be disseminating and talking. You were talking about disseminating through practice, but we actually need to be shouting that loudly, because we are in a period of Anthropocene. We don't change this. We are absolutely at the edge of that. So I think it's all interlinked, whether it's political, socially, economically, it all, we all live on this earth. And yeah.
So before we go to the environmental question about textiles, that's something that's on our list. I would like to go a bit deeper in what you were speaking about, of living with a sense of polarization. So I would like to ask Cordelia, because last week we were working with a group called VAST, which is Victims and Survivors Trust, about how did you see that embroidery or working with textiles could maybe help these people, like in the process of healing after the Good Friday Agreement?
I'm gonna speak from my experience with embroidery and then try to understand what I saw happening in the workshop. So in the embroidering, the movement that I was talking about, and that's the initiative in 2012 is called the Embroidering for Peace Initiative. So initially, and this was not started with great consciousness about peace or anything. It was, you could always, well, there was some consciousness, but you could embroider either a perpetrator or a victim. So polarization in those terms, and I remember a lot, many victims being embroidered, but I also remember people talking about, well, my brother was a sicario, so could you please embroider him? Like, I want him to be remembered too. And that is also something that is recorded about the beginnings, like anyone should be remembered. There was no one, especially because at least now there's a lot more known about the violence in Mexico, but back in the day, no one, like, there was a lot of stigma towards the people who had died, because it was thought that they were all criminals and they deserved their death. So in this regard, I think that there is a dynamic that crosses through the embroidering, through the act of embroidering together. And there's another dynamic that is the personal dynamic with the own story or the own object or the own, like, text that you're embroidering. And they create like a complexity that I think allows people to think otherwise, to rethink the story. And it also depends. I don't say that it's always effective, but I would say that there was some talk about how embroidery allowed people to verbalize or to see a little bit finer, a finer picture of their memory, or it allowed them to talk a little bit more, like come forward, like like to move from where they were stuck. So I believe that there is something that happens when people are together embroidering, and people are relating to what they're embroidering by themselves. And it is a very meditative exercise, and it allows another type of thought to emerge, or some new element to emerge, and people to move from where they were stuck. Maybe they don't change, but maybe they are able to think about the other person that they can't think about, or they're able to move a little step further in their elaboration of their own trauma. So I would say that something like that, I believe, happened with victims and survivors. And it was interesting how they symbolized it, how they congealed it in an image, which was for me very significant. For example, a butterfly or a shoe, and how that image plays a role in their story, and it's an entry point towards it. So I would leave it at that, how the progression and the creation of something gives way to this type of thinking and expression.
So speaking about images and symbolism, I would like to ask Roberta, which role has played textile art in the archiving process of the Troubles?
Well, in connection to the Troubles, we have worked very much into the idea of documenting political textiles. When I started the work here, I was told that there were no political textiles, and I knew from my experience, wherever there are women, there are going to be pieces that we'll find. And during a year, I visited different groups, and the different textile artists, or just ordinary women who belonged to a group, started to pull pieces that they had kept under the table without a name. So what we did was to bring these pieces out and analyze the Good Friday Agreement and see which of those topics were covered by textiles embroidered or stitched or sewing machine, because here it's a lot of sewing machine. And then for the topics that hadn't been covered by that, we presented Chilean arpilleras. And through a big project that was called Stitching and Unstitching the Troubles, that lasted 4 years and had 3 stages, we did exhibitions, and women from all parts of the town, especially in this area, came to see it and suddenly realized that they did have stories to tell, and that you didn't need to have somebody dead to be affected. It was affected because, I couldn't go to work because there was a police there and I couldn't cross. So these conversations facilitated the creation of a big number of arpilleras in Northern Ireland style. And some of them, 10, have become now part of the national archive of accounts of the Troubles, because we have proposed that textiles is a language. So some people would not give an oral testimony or a written testimony or don't want to be recorded. So these women told their stories and their experiences or their thoughts and feelings through these pieces. So this has been the biggest movement we could do through CAME and our digital archive that has the textiles in image, it has the textiles documented, and we have documented the people who made them. So that's a way. The other way has been to have in public spaces textiles and arpilleras from different parts of the world, so that this language is acknowledged not only by victims or people directly connected to the topic. So we have now in Queen's University at the library with the idea that whoever studies whatever goes and sees these pieces about the situation in Northern Ireland and in other countries, and in museums we have spaces where they rotate. So we have somehow created this network of discourse, and on the other hand, Ulster Museum has now acquired 14 textiles that tell stories of political violence in Northern Ireland, but also in other parts of the world. So it's expanding. The exhibition, The Troubles and Beyond, has expanded from the troubles and daily life, the troubles and beyond the territory, and techniques and methodologies. And I leave it there.
Well, I like this idea that you mentioned that textiles is a language, because at the end of the day, it's a material that we relate in a very intimate way every time we wake up in the morning, because we're deciding how do we want to dress, what do we want to communicate through this cloth. It's probably different how, for example, we were dressed before the panel discussion when we were working in the workshop, and now that we are actually presenting. So, and also, when you think about language and the documentation of language, there's a purpose of preserving it for future generations to come, but there's also a purpose of communicating something. And I think I like that what Alison mentioned about how we have a role in terms of like communicating and bringing awareness in terms of like fostering a more sustainable thinking. So I would like you to develop a bit more this idea and tell us what opportunity does Northern Ireland have by fostering their linen heritage to tackle climate change?
Well, I think we've touched on quite a lot of different themes actually tonight, which cut across, are cross-cutting in terms of climate change. And I know that for me, textiles is central to that. We had 100 years ago, we probably had nearly 50% of our population in Northern Ireland employed in the linen industry. So it was a provider, albeit a difficult one with a lot of different problems. But, the skill base was incredible, and the speed of invention was there. And so that is in our DNA. The idea of making is in our DNA in terms of textiles, just similar to Manchester being the Cottonopolis and Leeds or Yorkshire being the Woolenopolis and Huddersfield in those areas. So we had an identity. Our identity was tied up in that. And of course, we had wool as well. Wool was here before linen came, but linen replaced the cotton because we couldn't get that because of the American Civil War. So I think that the opportunity in terms of development is there. I think that there is, I touched on it in terms of climate change. Flax is a more responsible fibre. Hemp is even better as a sequester for our soil. So we think in terms of growing, a lot of the farmers I know in Northern Ireland are looking to diversify and are actually looking at crops that could, be planted and, also provide financial security for them, but also look at the kind of circular system that Helen MacArthur talks about rather than a linear system. And when I talk about contracting a supply chain, I mean growing, processing, constructing and making everything in Northern Ireland so that we aren't being harmful to our environment. I think as a designer, my understanding is that earth should be my number one consideration, that should be my client. Every time I design something, I need to think about earth first and foremost. So I think I need to think about where that's coming from. And, you know, if it's a waste product, we have a huge waste issue with our wool. I know I'm going away from linen, but we have a huge waste issue with the wool. So we need to think about that and how we're going to use that, because we grow our sheep to eat, not for the fibre, but we also have, you know, the prospect of producing linen again. And I am working with the DFE, the Department of the Economy, on looking at the potential to bring linen growing and spinning in some way back, or hemp growing and spinning back to Northern Ireland, because we have a massive composite industry here in Northern Ireland. We are part of a centre of excellence in terms of engineering, and so it may be textiles, but in a slightly different form to clothing. It could be interiors, or it could be in trains and on our buses, or it could be in our interior of our cars. And I think you mentioned in my introduction that I'm designing a roof garden, and I have developed composites in linens and in hemp for that roof garden to become part of that process. And I'm also growing it in that situ as well, to teach our young generation that it's a bit like food, and understanding that our food, there's a lot of effort goes into either growing food or producing food through animal husbandry, and it's the same with our clothing. There's a long and lengthy process to growing and to processing that fibre and weaving it or knitting it, and to throw 87% of it away within a couple of weeks, and to go off and buy something else. We have to stop that model. So yeah, so I think there's great potential in Northern Ireland to bring linen back. And many other things, other problems that we need to solve as well. But yeah, I think there is.
I like something that you said that came across as a bit different from maybe like the common narratives, because you stopped in the idea of how skills are relevant, and how skills are also relevant to fostering sustainable thinking. So following from skills, because I know that Cordelia is studying performative studies, and that both editions of Woven Hug and Mending Voids have been strongly connected to the idea of skills, I would like to ask you, how can textile art encourage more sustainable practices, both in the fashion industry, but also in changing our model of thinking?
I will just say that part of it has to do with what Alison was saying, that if you want to be conscious of where your food comes, you start to grow food, like even like the small little bean where you see the flower blooming. That's part of an education. And you go and visit, like when you want to see where people, I remember when I was younger, I would go visit factories to see how things were made, and I thought that was a really interesting experience. And it had to do with socializing perhaps many traditional roles, but taking something that has already been done is bringing all of these finer skills that not only have to do with, oh, you can become a seamstress or you can produce textiles, but it also has to do with connecting you to something broader than that the moment in the labor where you can be meaningfully connected to a process, to a creative process too. And of course, the fact, if you have visited already the workshop, you've seen that we are surrounded by scraps and by tons of donation and by material. Burlap, the Hessian, is not a very pleasant material, but it is something that connects us also to the history of arpillera making in that sense. So I have like a lot of faith in the very tangible nature of the materials, and especially I would see all of these clusters of things as performances of forgotten jobs, forgotten enterprises, forgotten practices as well. So I believe that they bring a lot of value to us, and I also believe it is a meaningful way to remember processes that formed a community. And I think that our current way of informing ourselves, of interacting, are constantly driving us away from those memories. And not that I don't say this because I'm a nostalgic. I say this also because as an educator, I do see that there is a struggle to understand or to make tangible or to deal with anxiety. And for me, this is a way of connecting with something very simple that has some potential and that holds people holds in the way that they're being they're touching something. So there is a touch, a sense of touch, but that it also holds people together in the sense that that if you create a sewing group, a sewing community, it also holds space for others. And I think that is something that is constantly being forgotten. So I think that they might seem like very meaningless skills that might not be immediately useful, but they are the skills of community building and appreciating and procedural finessing.
So following the idea that you mentioned, where actually skills are somehow connected to socializing and also how textile art can create and build communities, I would like to ask the last question to Roberta before we ask the audience if they have some questions. But I would like to stop a bit in that idea, because I remember that when we first sent the initial application to the Culture Lab at Monterrey, one of the conditions was that they only accepted residents that they created projects for and with the community. And for me as an artist, I think it has really changed my way of working, because I think it has given like a depth and a purpose to why I want to do things. And in that sense, Woven Hug has a strong purpose of building up communities, as I also believe that has Conflict Textiles as a collection over the years. So I would like to ask Roberta, why is Woven Hug being how does Woven Hug relate to Conflict Textiles in terms of building up communities?
Well, I think we believe strongly in different ways of relating to people who are working with textiles. And using the language. And we believe very much in partnerships, collaborations, and input. During the COVID and all the pandemic, I started to do much more work in my community, because my work has been mainly transnational, with a few things here, the big project, Stitching and Stitching the Travels, and the collaboration and contributions I do with the Ulster Museum. But I have been now working very strongly in in this area. So to bring, for me, coming here, bringing the grandchildren to the garden, having come quite often on a Saturday to the music, felt that this, what I had seen in your description, in your videos, that we documented, because when we document, we get to know the projects. We partnered with you, we collaborated with you in a way in which we saw the interconnection of what we were doing and the use of Hessian, that you see that all our pieces have as a backing Hessian, and the obligation of whoever shows our pieces has to show it on Hessian, because we want that they always remember the humble origin. So the idea of partner, and you saw the sack that Bridge brought 2 days ago, that is an original sack, in which we really felt that Woven Hug would do that, get into the community, bring it into the gardens, and be able to speak beyond the workshop itself that happens inside.
So having said that, I would like to ask if our audience has any questions.
Thank you to the panel. That was the most interesting and engaging response to the questions. Just to maybe take it a bit further and think about textiles and peace, where are we with that? You can interpret it whichever way you want. Thank you.
Well, I think one of the ways to approach peace is dealing with conflict. You have to deal with it. So we have, as I say, through the Good Friday Agreement, we did all these workshops in which women from different communities started to make their arpilleras. The museum here owns 21 pieces that have been all product of the exhibition. And the other thing we have done, we did now a really nice exhibition on the Good Friday Agreement in Limavady, in which we also commissioned pieces and textiles that I brought today. So after this presentation, we can see them, in which a textile artist did John Hume, or did Pat Hume, or did different representations. So through engaging with people who have been peacemakers, but are ordinary people. So we had the exhibition in Limavady with a scarf of Pat Hume and the tie of John Hume. And then when the children came, I said, what do you think about that? My grandfather has that. So the figure of the big peacemaker, distant, became close, and said, maybe you will be a peacemaker tomorrow. So it's this idea that the tangibility in the ordinary act, and believe that by acknowledging what happened, you have a step further to understand the other, because you don't need to convince the other or think the same. You have to really live together with people who think differently. And nowadays, the differences are many more, because it's not only two communities. There are so many people who have come. I invite everybody to see the exhibition that is now in Coleraine, that has 29 people who have come to live here and have lived for years and years and years, and are absolutely blended in the community and have brought their expertise, their culture, their humor, and their ways. So I think that is a very important element for building peace, to see the other, not being afraid of the other, but feeling that the others are all in the same boat.
Would any of the speakers would like to add anything else about
I think I had quite an interesting experience. Obviously, I've been teaching for a long time, and it would be one of the perhaps concepts or themes that students might like to look at. And I know that in 2018, with the Fashion and Freedom project that we did, which was a UK-wide project, but mainly in London, Cardiff, Edinburgh and Belfast, because they were the key areas for the suffragettes, really pushing for the vote. A lot of the students got involved in making and looking at historical references in terms of, the Troubles and their own recent history. And while we were looking right back to 2017, 2018 and women getting the vote, our students turned to looking at the 70s and 80s and the peace movement, actually, and the woman's role in the peace movement. And it was so interesting. And they actually watched, I think there were 3 really interesting documentaries at the time, and they went back and re-looked at those and the woman's role in that peace movement, and how the men were not very pleased about the woman's role, because they were, as you were talking, they were saying, where are my sons and what's happening to my friends and all the people in my environment. And they were being told to go back into their kitchen, and that was on both sides of the political parties, were doing that. So it was very interesting for those students in recent times to look at that again and actually see that the women were trying to bring change, And then they then started to create and make around then. So I think there's great hope for peace, because I think this generation are looking at it with a different set of eyes, and they are looking back with a different set of eyes, and they have experienced a sense of normality. So I think that the healing will be through our children and through our young people, and I think that's a very positive and hopeful thing. And I think that textiles is a medium for great change, whether that's climate change and changing how we do things, or how we see things, and how we express those feelings and ways of doing things. So I think, yeah, it's very powerful.
Before we accept the next question, I would like to highlight the importance of what you've just mentioned, Alison, of when you're in processes of peace, trying to somehow address and present the different points of views. And I would strongly recommend people, if they have the chance to visit Ulster Museum, to get the book that's called something like Curating the Troubles and Beyond. I can't remember the exact title, but I read it before coming here, and it really gave me an insight of the incredible work that has done Ulster Museum in trying to curate the troubles, but always addressing the different points of views. Because what the book is highlighting is that it's okay to have a different opinion from another person, but then you have to tolerate a different opinion. And I think there's a strong importance of how arts can somehow give a space to do activities where people actually can share with people with different opinions and can realize that it's okay to have a disagreement. So following up from that, I would like to know if there's any other question in the audience.
Hi, Alison. I wanted to know if you knew anything of the significance of the white handkerchief.
In terms of the are you talking about Bloody Sunday?
Yes.
Well, I think obviously that, it was really about, calling the truce, and, in a very difficult situation, it was coming out and saying, we want peace, and we want to be able to express our peace in this way. And, I think that it was very significant, but it was also a bloodied white handkerchief, because the blood that had been spilt on that day was quite significant. And that was a watershed moment, wasn't it, for our nation, really, and for our children and our young people, and for change.
Did you actually see the play on the day?
No, I haven't seen the play,
right,
no.
Okay. Well, it commemorated 50 years of Bloody Sunday, and they actually presented each of the 13 families with a white handkerchief with the name of the person who died on it. I just wanted to know whether you were aware of the significance of a piece of material.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I think you see that across, even with the, the mothers, again, who've been, in the Magdalene laundries, and all of the significance of, if you're talking about that in terms of fabric, and the significance of fabric and keeping, where they kept the, I can't remember the name of the museum, actually, in London, it's just gone out of my head, where they had to give their babies away, and that was across Ireland as well, and they kept pieces of fabric for the children of their babies and they kept it in this book. And there's a great significance in that, because there's a connectivity, isn't there? So there's that's a beautiful thing. Unfortunately, I haven't seen that, but it's a beautiful thing in a way, because it's connecting a place and a people and a circumstance. And there's a real thing about that. And I think that's like heirlooms, isn't it? So where you pass down perhaps, a wedding dress, or a christening robe, or it could be, there is that memory, isn't there? There's that memory and a connection to that, to keep that, the importance of that. It's a very haptic thing, and a very beautiful thing. Yes, absolutely.
It definitely keeps it real.
It absolutely keeps it real, and that's important. I was thinking actually when you were talking as well about recently in Ukraine, and how they are sewing on their pieces of patches onto of the red and white and red, you know, how they are rising up against some of the things that have happened to people who are protesting or speaking against something. And that's a very similar thing, you know, with the handkerchief or just speaking against something. And you were talking, you know, we've all been talking about that in a way, how hard that is, but how important it is to have something that's of significance and memory.
If I can add one other extremely powerful example is the piece called Common Loss by Irene McWilliam, that is made out of 3,161 red pieces of cloth torn apart. So she did at some point rang the police and said, I can't listen anymore. How many people have died in this conflict? And she was given that number, and she built this incredible peace quilt that is called Common Loss. It's going to be at the Ulster Museum from September 2024 until January 25, together with other pieces of Northern Ireland. I think it's the first person who put all the people who died together with no order from where they came. And the act of tearing the red piece, and different people from different countries sent a red material. Some have a design of a teddy bear that means a child who died, or different symbols in the pieces. So and that my first exhibition started with this piece that I found under the desk of Irene McWilliam.
I think that tearing fabric is a powerful gesture. Recently, with Cordelia and a group of collaborators, last March in Monterrey, actually in San Pedro at Centro Cultural Plaza Fátima, we did a performance in the gardens called Mending Voids, and we had a fabric that was kind of like skin color, and each of the participants was reading a news related to violence in Mexico, and then they came inside and torn the fabric, and came inside and torn the fabric, until at the end they kind of like mended it with reused dyes. And the interesting thing was, first, I guess the momentum, there was a kind of like depth and almost friedness behind, and everyone was very silent. But then also like how the final piece, it somehow replicated or simulated a scar. So I think that Cordelia as well has some experience working with handkerchiefs. Maybe she would like to expand.
On the handkerchief, and just I think that my favorite part of the process, and I've been hoping to be more connected to that, and I think that mending voids was one way of doing that, is just holding just the act of holding the fabric and seeing what that means, offering it. And I'm being very literal, like that. That is something that has been more my focus now. So it's interesting to see, it was interesting to see with this performance, people doing the gesture of cutting and also doing the gesture of trying to mend in a very frantic way towards the end. So I like to observe how these very spontaneous reactions to handkerchiefs, and I know of Bloody Sunday, but and perhaps I've read about that play and the handkerchief. But now that you're putting it into you're bringing it into the fore, I can see the handkerchief, and I've had so many of these embroidered handkerchiefs in my hands that I always feel that, and I always recall how people give them to me, like, or if I am collecting them or something, or how I've archived them. And there is a very interesting relationship, a connection to the piece of cloth, and especially the type of piece, now that I've been more in touch with handkerchiefs, it's the type of piece of cloth that would be stored away. So bringing it out is always so meaningful to play with that image and what it can mean, and also how the scraps, or making something from scraps, just seeing the scrap, like I've become enamored of that moment more than the end result. And I think that is the moment where something really tremendous happens. And it's not the moment that solves things, but it is the moment where something starts to happen and then something else needs to follow.
I think that's very interesting, the whole idea of a handkerchief. I buried my father yesterday, and the one thing my daughter asked for was his handkerchief. So I think that's really poignant, that those handkerchiefs were handed out with the names on. I think it's about memory. It's beautiful.
Well, with that, sharing that very intimate experience, I would like to know if anyone else in the audience has a last question to finish the panel.
I'm just like thinking about how important the context of a piece is. I was really like struck at the context of what had happened in Chile. Obviously, it was before my time, so I wasn't aware of everything that had happened. And just hearing about it and seeing I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but the epieras that were produced and the meaning behind them, I find it really striking. And as someone who didn't know the conflict and someone who didn't know the context but found it out and it really added to the piece, I was just wondering if any of you guys have any insight on how we can create impact with a piece that's presented to people who are not aware of the context or loss that the people creating it have experienced.
Well, I think the big challenge is always to present pieces that the core is what they bring out in the person who sees it. You give a little bit, when we exhibit, we always put a very small label to make the person just to give a connection, but then it's the whole process of what it triggers in the person and how the person relates to the piece and the connections it does. That's why our pieces in the archive will always keep a record of all the exhibitions they have been and with other textiles so that you can understand the interactions that have happened and you can almost perceive the public who has seen it. So that gives another life. It's the layers and layers, and it's the preservation and conservation of the textiles, because it's not to have them to store them. For instance, whenever we get a donation, we only receive a piece if we have a space where we are going to show it and we are going to document it. We are not going to accumulate. We want to break the circle of having much, having more, or even sometimes I ask myself, why do we collect so much if we then have to destroy and get rid of it? So it's the idea of using, documenting, sharing, and putting in context those pieces that will speak to others and will bring out. We have done some experiences in which we have had invitations to only men to see an exhibition, and then have discussions between men, what they read of the discussions of women. And it's been extremely interesting. We have received films and songs that they have composed in response to the political language of women they hadn't seen. And I think that's all I can say about that.
Thank you, Roberta. I would like to know if our guest speakers, either Cordelia or Alison, have something else to add before we close.
I suppose I was thinking as you were speaking there, Roberta, and it's quite interesting to me that actually any textile exhibition has the largest footfall, certainly in the UK. I'm not sure about the world, but certainly I know in the UK that if you put on a textile exhibition, people go to it. And there is an absolute connectivity and obviously an appreciation or, an understanding of that. So I think that is really interesting. And yet, in terms of the hierarchy of art, fine art, it's right down there. It's one of the lowest, sculpture being the highest, and then, painting, and then printmaking. So there's definitely a hierarchy, and textiles is not up there. Textile art is not there. I think it's because of women. It's largely because of its feminine handicraft. If you think of textile, if you think of the artists who crochet and knit and embroider, and I think it's largely a woman's activity, or has been. Not so much now. We're changing that landscape, but I do think that, and I'm a design person. I'm not an artist, but I can observe and see that. And when I've worked in that field and I've supported, students. It amazes me that we get huge footfall even into our show at the end of the year. We're always commended as being one of the best areas. We get into the RUA, we do very well in the IDI and, different exhibitions, in actually the UK and Ireland, and even globally. But I think it's very interesting. I think in terms of, it's interesting, but the people connect with it. And, I think that's important, because that's what's going to really bring change, isn't it, that connectivity?
I hope that this panel maybe opens a future panel about trying to understand why is textile art considered a craft and not fine art. And getting into that, it was, I think, 2 years ago. I apologize if I'm not referencing correctly, but when Yinka Shonibare curated the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy, there was a documentary at the BBC that was, telling about the whole curatorial process, but also that one of the first times a woman was accepted at the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy, it was with an embroidery piece. But then the problem was that when the curators actually saw the piece and realized it was embroidery, they didn't put it in the exhibition. And what I thought was very interesting at the summer exhibition curated by Yinka Shonibare was that he selected lots of textile pieces. And I think it's kind of like getting in more into like contemporary artworks, but I think that we still have a lot to do. And also I think that textile has a power to bring communities together that other media don't. So I don't know if Cordelia would like to add anything else before we end up this panel discussion.
I just want to add that I've been relating a lot of my work with textiles to the power of touch, to the particular engagement that touch fosters, and it is very interesting how Black intellectuals in the United States have been very interested in touch. Not only Black intellectuals, but it's been a very interesting itinerary of learning also to see the world and to see the art piece and to engage with touch with that very big potential of being connected, while at the same time it also touch or approaching someone through touch is also a very threatening thing. It can also become something very threatening or disliked if it's an abuse. It's a leeway for both things. And especially Hortense Spillers has been lecturing about this. And I believe that, and she uses examples from Toni Morrison's Beloved and the quilts. There's many images about the hands and about hands doing things and touching the body and a lot of things, but there is also a lot of reflection upon quilts and the creation of quilts and caressing. So I think that it's also that there is a potential in cloth, in touch, to address certain, Beloved is about a haunted life in recently emancipated United States, Black United States. So I think that if we come from if this is the context that we have been given, this devaluing context, maybe there is a big potential to express certain topics in this medium, and there is still a lot to explore and still a lot to build, especially if one wants to talk about deep oppressions, like really strong feelings, and not do it through the language that keeps oppressing us. So I think that it's a huge, I would see it as always as a huge potential, and that it's always the choice of people to vouch for it and to value it. And there is starting to be, because I think that there is also a hunger for this other language to not fall into the same traps of a language that divides us. So I think that there is something there to be said about it, and I am also someone who just came to learn a lot of these things, but I think that a lot of us come to learn these very concrete details through these very simple explorations, these very available explorations of textile work.
Well, and to conclude, I would like to take that idea of how textile language is always inclusive and inviting, because we have experience with Woven Hug that in every workshop we have a participant that tells us, I've never had done anything with textiles in my life. And then after a while, they're working really well. And you think like, but how come you told me you never done this before? And I think that it's a really powerful way of bringing communities together, of expressing, and also of building a different way of pushing new narratives and maybe more sustainable ways of thinking, because most of Woven Hug project has been made with recycled materials. So having said that, I wanted to thank to everyone that has come tonight. This panel discussion is going to be broadcasted through Conflict Textiles YouTube channel once it's ready. And I would also like to extend the invitation to the other activities we're still having connected to Woven Hug. So we're having tomorrow, Friday, and between Monday to next Wednesday, workshops in the afternoon where we need to finish a piece, as the private view is going to be next Thursday, so the piece needs to be on by then. This Saturday as well, we will have drop-in sessions for families from 10:30 a.m. to like mid-afternoon. And then this Sunday, we're going to co-host or co-facilitate a special workshop at Lisbon at Our Space Project, Our Space Gallery, with the textile artist as well, Emma Whitehead. So you're all more than invited to the activities, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Okay.